Right, we're ready. Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll introduce ourselves as we move through the presentation. I'm just doing a very brief introduction, so I'm going to go and sit somewhere else in a minute. My name is Leslie Gray. I'm the Deputy Director for Digital Initiatives and Strategy in Cambridge University Library. I was the Alma Implementation Manager and Head of Digital Services during our Primo and Alma implementations. Can you press the next slide, please? There are around about 100 libraries in Cambridge. We are based in the main university library. The University Library is one of the UK's 6 legal deposit libraries, and in 2016 we celebrated our 600th anniversary. So 600 years there's been a library in Cambridge. Although we are a very decentralised university, we now have 23 department and faculty libraries which are administratively part of the main university library. This is an ongoing process, and there are still 31 independent faculty and department libraries within the university as well. We're a collegiate university with 32 colleges, of which 31 actually have college libraries. Colleges are independent institutions within Cambridge, so we do not have any administrative responsibilities for the colleges. There are also a number of associated research institutions in Cambridge that work very closely with us. So we work closely together as a library community in Cambridge, mainly by coordination and a lot of legwork to bring us together. In total, about 93 of the libraries use the Alma system. They don't use it in all areas of functionality. Some still run their own independent systems. We have been Voyager customers since 2002, and we migrated and went live with Alma in January this year. We implemented Primo for the first time in the new UI in September 2016. We have come from the Voyager world. We had a very complex setup in Voyager. At the time we migrated from an in-house system to Voyager, we worked even more independently of each other in Cambridge. We just used the same system. And so we needed to set up a library system in which all the libraries could really work independently of one another. They had their own circulation policies. We didn't even have any shared cataloging standards or policies. So we ended up with 10 Voyager databases. We pulled those databases together. 9 of them were circulating databases using a product called Universal Borrowing, in which you had a master record or a home record, and then you had a concept of stub or children records. So there were multiple patron records across the databases for a single patron, across the databases and actually within the same database. Since 2002, the way libraries in Cambridge work has changed substantially, and we have come together. We work far more closely together, and there are now some agreed standards, practices, and ways of working. So it was a challenging implementation. We moved from this very library-specific policy environment into a single institution, and have done a lot of work on harmonizing and bringing together some of the policies and practices. Because, as you know, Alma runs on institutional policies. So we've had challenges of deduplication of records as we've come from these databases. Even within the databases, we had duplicate copies because each library had a concept of record ownership. Each library had their own set of vendor records. So it has been a big challenge to bring that all together. Of course, there is still quite a lot of work to do, and one of the areas in which we still have a lot of work to do is in the fulfillment area. The presentation today will talk about some of the work that we've had to do to bring in a user management system and also to prepare the patron records, the user records for use in the Alma system. Right, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, and they will tell you about the work that they've done with the APIs. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello. My name is Oladeji from Akinwa, and during the Alma implementation, I was essentially the systems librarian. So if you're scratching your head wondering why we had to jump through so many hoops, you could probably blame me for it. As my colleague Leslie mentioned, we basically started out with 10 Voyager databases, use of the Voyager's clustering and universal borrowing facility, which unfortunately over the years we literally abused to get it to work for the Cambridge environment as at then. And what more importantly, we had each of the libraries essentially had their own local Patron files, which allowed them to do all sorts of things with it. But of course, as we knew as we were going into Alma, this would no longer be possible. During the data migration, it took us several iterations to get it correctly. Typically, most people have 1 or 2 tries, but I think we had like 3 or 4 tries before we got it to a good enough state. But even at that, the data basically was not usable. So we needed to do some additional work to it. So as you can see there, essentially, when the data migration happened, all the patrons ended up with an institution level association, which for Cambridge would not work. We needed to give each of the patrons associations with their specific libraries. The other thing were that as part of the migration process, we needed to harmonize, reduce the number of user groups we had. So we went down from about just over 600 to somewhere in the ballpark of about 30. And then finally, with the state in which the migrated data was handed over to us, essentially nobody could log into Primo or Alma. Before we go into the details of what we did in order to get the system ready for us to use, I just want to talk a bit about why. In Cambridge, we've got multiple authentication systems. So we've got one system which works for university and for university staff and students. We also have another system which works for essentially non-university people, but we also had a third system, which was the Voyager system, which allowed people access to their library account. So invariably, we needed to harmonize a lot of the identifiers which were migrated over. And my colleague here will talk a bit more detail into it. But at the end of the day, that was the main drive, or one of the main drivers for having us go through this process of harmonizing the identifiers that were migrated. The first thing we did was, of course, to get the data out of Alma. We used the SIS export process. That was convenient, it was fast, it was essentially an out-of-the-box solution, and that worked for us. We manipulated the data. Again, my colleague will go into more detail about that. And then, of course, the fun began in trying to get the data into it, get the data back into Alma. The SIS export, the SIS loader was considered, but as at that time, XLibris made us aware that the patron role could not be changed. So invariably, we were forced to use the user APIs. There were concerns around that time about the speed, but in discussing with XLibris, they were able to make some adjustments for us, which allowed us to get the job done in quite a very speedy fashion. So without taking too much time, I will hand over to the actual developer on the work.
Hello, my name's James Howe. I am an actual developer. I'm the senior software developer at the University Library. And I'm just sort of take you through some of our experience with what we did to this data and how we use the Alma User APIs to get everything back in, and some of the many problems we encountered on the way. So we actually did 2 big migrations. The first one, probably the most important, was in January. This is just before we went live. I think we had a window of about 2 days where XLibris sent the data over, and we had about 2 days to fix it all before the next process started, and everyone came back from the holiday. So it was about 300,000 records we exported there. We changed 180,000 of them, pushed them back in. The rest we ignored for that moment because we didn't really need them. It was mostly old data. That process, well, it went all right. We succeeded and managed to go live. About 15, 20 records needed manual intervention after we'd been through all of our automated processes to put them back in. We then did another migration in June for various reasons, but that was when we were going live with our external management system, which might not have time to get into, but that was a slightly different problem, because by then it was a live system. It was currently being used by library staff in all the libraries. We had, again, about 300,000 records to export. As you can see, a few thousand more had appeared since January. In that case, we changed about 180,000 again and deleted about 120,000 records. That would be old records that we decided we didn't need anymore, getting rid of. Some records we would have liked to have deleted so that we'd skipped them in the first one, but they still had open transactions and things, and Alma doesn't let you delete those, so we had to modify those and keep them around a bit still for that. So that's the rough overview of what we did. In more sort of specifics, as we said, we used the SAS FTP export to get everything out into a big pile of XML files. I'm sure you're familiar with that. That took about 1.5 hours to run through that. We then converted that all to a JSON stream format, just because all our tools and all our tooling was sort of designed for working on JSON representations of the data. And while the Alma API does work on JSON, the export doesn't. So we generated a conversion tool from the XML schema to convert that through for us. Did all of our transformations on the records. This was, as Deji covered, assigning the correct patron roles and user groups by synchronizing the patron data with various other university systems, had all the data in, rearranging all of the identifiers. So the original imported records from Voyager, the primary identifier was usually, but not always, a barcode. And because we have multiple systems that the patrons will be in, some of them have multiple barcodes, some of them have different types of identifiers. There's no guarantee that any particular user has any particular kind of identifier. So we generated a new set of identifiers, UUIDs, to use as the primary, so that it's independent of all of the other systems we're trying to synchronize them with. And then wrote them all back to Alma through the APIs. So the transformation stuff, we had all that automated with a bunch of scripts. That took about an hour to run through those 300,000. And then writing them back to Alma, we built another Python tool using the async.io libraries, which lets you essentially parallelize the usage of the Alma API. So you're not waiting, you're not doing a request and waiting with a response. You're doing multiple requests at the same time. This sort of did all the management about handling errors and retrying and scheduling things to keep under the rate limits and stuff. That took about 2 hours on both occasions for all the operations that were needed. So that's what we did. Along the way, as I mentioned before, a number of challenges and issues came up. The first of which, some records were not accessible via the API. The first reason, once we'd received the data that had been imported from all the Voyagers. There were over 500 primary identifiers that had been duplicated. So you'd see normally 2 each. So I think a few had 3 records with the same primary identifier. So over 1,000 records involved in that. When you try and interact with those records through the API, the behavior is quite inconsistent. Sometimes you'd get a server error, 500 tell you that. Sometimes it would tell you that record's not found. So even though you've got 2 of them, it says there aren't any. The worst problem, though, is sometimes you do an API call to one of these duplicate records and it succeeds, but you have no way of knowing which record it succeeded with, which can lead to data loss and so on. If you hadn't worked out you had these duplicates and you were trying to delete one of the copies, it would delete the other one. So that was annoying. Also, we had 160 records that had no identifiers whatsoever. And you could see them in the search, you could see them in the user export, you can see them through the Alma UI, but with no identifier whatsoever, there's no way of referencing them in the API to do anything with them. So in a way that's slightly better because you couldn't then break them, but they couldn't be interacted with. The solution to these problems was just lots of clicking, unfortunately. Basically, a couple of people had to sit down or go through the Alma UI, just clicking through them all, mostly deleting them, or at least deleting one copy of them, and just manually going through 1,000 or so records, sorting them out, which we did. Fortunately, none of these records were ones that were particularly important. Wasn't like didn't belong to the head librarian or any important people. So we left them till after our initial migration. A second problem, again with identifiers, is that the behavior of the way Alma checks for identifiers is a bit inconsistent in that you can have as many copies of an identifier as you want on different records as long as they're all inactive. But as soon as one of them becomes active, it starts enforcing that no records can have that identifier in them. So if you've had 6 records all with the same inactive identifier and then activate it on one of them, the API then won't let you make any changes to the other ones anymore, and unless you are removing those inactive identifiers. So it's a bit annoying when you're trying to use stuff because when you're trying to use the API to work on a particular record, whether that your changes are going to work or not depends on changes that are happening on other records. Things are not independent, and it's slightly compounded by the fact that if you're searching in Alma, you can't find inactive identifiers; they just don't show up. So it's a bit hard to get around that. That ends up with people search for someone, they can't find them, they add another version, they add another record and duplicate that identifier, and then the old one can't be updated anymore. The solution here was basically just to do multiple passes over our data export to find all the duplicates, rather than try and work out the correct order you have to do every change in order to get them all to work first time. We instead just collected the ones that failed and did them at the end again. So because this way some updates block other updates from happening when you're changing identifiers. So basically just retry in a different order, and that sorts that out. Problem number 3 sort of makes these other problems keep coming back, especially after we'd gone live and people started using it, is that you can create duplicate identifiers with the primary identifiers. You can create 2 pairs of records that both have an active identifier. It's the same identifier. So if you just a quick step by step, if you create your first user with a primary identifier and add an inactive sort of second identifier to it, it then lets you create a second user with that primary identifier, because it doesn't enforce it because it's inactive, and it lets you do that. However, it then also lets you reactivate the additional identifier back on the first user. So that's where the flaw lies on that. I checked last week, it's still not been fixed. This then creates more instances of the first problem, where the API behavior is inconsistent and can do unpleasantly dangerous things. We haven't really found a solution for that, other than getting people not to do this and periodically checking to make sure there are no horrible duplicates hiding around. We actually have all of our records mastered in our own external system, where we completely forbid any duplicates, which usually sorts that out. The fourth one, so I said one of our migration things we had to do was move the primary identifiers around. You can't do that in one API call. So that's the transformation there. We wanted to move the primary ID into the secondary identifiers and generate a new primary ID. Even though both states there are completely valid states, the API won't let you do that in a single operation. You have to go through sort of a secondary bit. We in the end generated a third identifier just to make the tracking easier. Where you could just go change the primary identifier first, and while removing the one you want to put back in, and then keep it out. Just something about the way it runs its validation. It thinks what you're doing is going to create a duplicate when it isn't. And then, yeah, there's a strange, something might appear in that red circle. The fifth problem is that the XML schema is not actually true. If you go in Alma and you create a record and you just remove all its contact details, and you access it through the API or the user export, you will see a bit of XML looks like that, just says it's got nothing. However, the schema specifies that there is always at least one email, which isn't true. We just had to just not believe the schema and edit that ourselves. Slightly more concerning is that when we're coming to our second migration, we found that the data structure had changed. Some new items had appeared in the XML that hadn't updated the user schema, so they all failed validation. We reported it. The schema was updated, but the version number of the schema was not updated, so you can't tell that it's different. So the current version of the schema, if you download it now, will only work on the new data, or well, actually, it will also work on the old data, but if you have old data, it won't validate against the old schema. Other way around. Anyway, the schema isn't true, basically, at all times. Another one is that the UI lets you save data that the API doesn't think is invalid. So if you have staff members doing stuff on your live system, they can accidentally lock your records. The API again can't actually make changes to them until you do a change that actually fixes this problem. I've got some. It's the one that most commonly comes up is when you bulk add roles in the UI, it saves them all as inactive without scope or permission or parameters on them. Which the Alma UI is perfectly happy to do because it's inactive. It won't let you activate them without putting the scope in, but the API does not let you do that. So any changes you do to that don't address it, the API will tell you you can't have that, it's got no scope, even though it's still inactive. So the only sort of solution we have there is whenever we read a record out that we're going to change, we have to go through its roles and stuff and just delete stuff that looks invalid, which is a little tricky because for roles, the set of parameters that are required and what values they're allowed to have isn't always fixed. It depends on various combinations that are going on. So we basically just had to trial and error it and put in special cases in the code for specific invalid roles. Another problem, the country codes aren't actually enforced when you use the API. So the country field in addresses is supposed to be a value that's on a special coded table configured in Alma. For all the other values that we found like that, if you try and set it to something that's not on that list, it tells you that's invalid. This doesn't happen for country codes. Isn't the end of the world, because you can obviously validate it externally, but it is just another thing to be aware of. Also, there's a bug in one of the UIs that, again, is still there, but hopefully should be fixed soon, is that one of the versions of the forms that let you edit users, instead of leaving the country code empty, will set it to the literal string null, which doesn't cause any problems because it happens to not be validated, but it will fail your external validation if you're using that to try and work it out. So I say yes, the solution there was we made sure it was a standard code set and did our extra validation. The last problem, I think this is the last one we'll talk about. Yes, so we were generating our external IDs, generate a UUID, which you see there is quite long. A couple of problems we had with this while we were live is that there are actually two create user forms that are accessible to people using Alma. One of them will generate an ID for you. The other one doesn't and makes it a required field. And we found a lot of staff are not capable of generating random IDs. They would just put in, for example, the barcode, which we then had to migrate out afterwards, or all kinds of mess. And the payment integration we were using had a 30-character max for identifiers. So after the first migration, we found no one could pay any fines because all the IDs were now too long. So our solution, and again, in about half the places in Alma, when it's telling you who's done something, it gives you their name. In the other half, it gives you their ID. So those weren't very friendly and we sort of found hard to use. Our solution was to just change them all again. So on our second migration, we changed them all again to be a bit shorter and go through. So in summary, really, all these problems can be summarized by the identifier system not really working properly. The sort of distinction of the primary ID and the other IDs behaving differently doesn't really work. And the Alma UI lets you do stuff that is not validated by the API, which can cause problems. A few recommendations just to make life easier. When you do a query, you can specify the ID type. The only value you can't put in there is primary ID. So if you have ambiguous things going on, provide some way to serialize edits. This would prevent data loss, make sure in a concurrent situation, things aren't disappearing. I won't go into too much detail there, but that's a particular way that would be nice to use it. Just allow a put to create records. At the moment, if you don't know whether a record exists or not, you have to try the put, and if it doesn't work, do the post, or vice versa. If your put could also create records, you just need to do one call. And to actually use the XML schema internally in the system to make sure it's always correct. And just a minor one, offer JSON exports, just would have saved us a step, but there we go. I think we've got about 4 minutes left or so, if there's any questions.
You said you had problems with roles and scopes when you were loading the roles and scopes with Alma. I'm just wondering which roles you loaded. Did you load, because we load just patrons, You know, so we don't load any fancy roles on top of that. Do you load other roles
We do,
for your
yeah.
staff?
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know more about that.
Okay.
Anybody else have a question?
A small question. What made you aware of the duplicates in the files?
Well, we were testing our process quite a few times, and yeah, the first run through we did had a bunch of failures. Went to look at them, went, hang on, we've got all these identifiers in here twice. That's how we found them. Yeah.
Did you have any problems with API limits? There's quite a high number of...
Not really, no. The whole process of writing back with the API took about 2 hours. I think the API limit's it's 25 a second or something like that. If you just do the maths, that sort of works out. It's because we parallelized our write-backs. We managed to just... If you were doing it in serial and waiting for each one to finish, it takes a lot longer than that. But if you just do lots at once, it's fine.
Thank you for all this insight there, especially those small things that work on the one end and where Alma doesn't stick to its own rules. We've noticed that at several points as well. Whenever Alma is handling XML, you really have to be careful. Even though XML is really designed for being strict with data, usually it isn't strict at all. Sometimes it doesn't even care about namespaces, even though they are specified in the provided schema in the developer network, or the namespace can be missing and it doesn't matter, or stuff like that, where I would expect the record to be rejected. So if anybody here, I'm looking in this corner, could take that, it would be really great to be strict about data. We had this with the configuration of norm vocabularies, stuff like that, where we can put in XML, and some values weren't allowed, and the recommendation was then just to abuse it beyond the schema, and which was a bit of a worries me to see that it causes trouble in the end.
Yeah, so we only used the schema just to convert the export to JSON, and even then we had a couple of problems. But yeah, it's not. There is a schema, but it doesn't appear to be used anywhere by Alma itself. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. No?
Sorry.
We have various feeds coming in from our other university systems for new students. We take them into our user management system, which gets rid of most of these problems, and then write them in.
Okay, thank you, James, EJ, and Leslie.